Nick Percival talking on the deficiencies of Einstein's SRT and GRT. Yeah, we can see the purple type.
Yep, just bear with me and we'll start.
This talk will be the first of 3 short talks, each talk giving a brief argument about why we need to abandon the relativist view and go to the absolute view, at least if we want to have an accurate understanding of what's happening physically. For this talk, we're saying there must be a preferred frame. The data shows that all clocks at rest in the same frame, other things being equal, for example, gravitational potential, have the same clock rate. In fact, our international standards on time, such as this for the second, is based on that empirical data. Second, GPS is a working system, working to very high precision, and the GPS data shows that clock rate is a function of velocity. The satellite clock rate is manually adjusted to account for its increased velocity in the orbit, which in turn affects its clock rate. Hence, velocity affects clock rates. From these 2 points, it follows that frames can be ordered by clock rate. If each frame has a different rate based on velocity, then we have we just rate them. We just put them in order by velocity and clock rate. Frames can be ordered by clock rate, yielding a hierarchy where the frame that has the fastest clock rate is, by definition, at least for this part of physics, the preferred frame. And this is in fact confirmed in detail to high precision by tons of GPS data. Okay, hopefully all you heard that. I may have to go back. So I'd like your comments. I'm not sure I can hear people. Let's see.
Okay, well, I might comment, Nick. As far as I know, binary mechanics is the only companion you have in terms of a preferred frame. Are we going to talk about whether special relativity is being debunked or not, or is that really part of this session?
Yes, in fact, this was the assertion by special relativity that there is no preferred frame, and even in the weaker.
Okay, well then
one can't determine the preferred frame. Here it is. There is a preferred frame, and we can determine the preferred frame.
Fantastic. Well, I would humbly submit that your wonderful work here is incomplete on 2 bases. One is why is the special theory of relativity at fault? Why? And the second one,
Hold it, let me just take it one by one.
Okay.
I'm not saying that it's at fault. I'm just saying that one of its major foundational components has been proved incorrect, allegedly, by this 3-step piece of logic, because that shows that there is a de facto preferred frame, particularly for kinematics, the special relativity kinematics.
Okay, well, again, the question is why is there that defect that you have identified? And I would humbly submit that the reason for the defect or the lack in the presentation up to now is the lack of questioning the axioms on which special relativity is based, which include continuous space-time. In other words, the use of deductive reasoning might suggest that we go back to explain why these defects are observed is because the axiom, in other words, continuous space-time, is really the bad guy.
Right. I agree. I'm not saying that this is the best possible deduction. I'm just saying it's one that's pretty easy to follow, and it's based on empirical evidence from the GPS system, which is known to be pretty darn accurate. So this is just one more argument, and I think what you were talking about is perhaps more fundamental, but I've tried that approach with relativists, and it's a lot more complicated to get the point across, and they tend to ignore that argument. So let me ask if any others have their own comments or comments on what James has just said. Bill, Harry?
Yeah, I have a few comments. The scientific method that we're using, we don't define it real well. And so it sounds like you're using the existential scientific method. And the French, following Henri Poincaré, have developed what's called meta theory. And it says they've proven theorems in meta theory that have to be satisfied in order for a theory to become fundamental or true. And so there, some of the rules there are no two theories can use the same fundamental constant, such as C. Well, special and general relativity use C, and electrodynamics uses C. And if you look at the logic that Isaac Newton had, he said that in electrodynamics, you should solve all of the 8 known empirical equations that deal with electrodynamics, and you should be able to predict all the results that relativity theory has been used to predict, but you don't need a separate theory of relativity. And so that's interesting. In the way that I work, I just try to show that you can derive from electrodynamics alone the work that seems to support the data that seems to support special relativity and general relativity. But of course, there's things that special relativity and general relativity cannot predict, and those are shown not to exist by electrodynamics. So
okay, let me just interject here. I'm agreeing with what James said. I'm agreeing with what Bill has said. These are very powerful fundamental arguments. But I think because they, and this is not meant to replace it or say this one is better. I'm saying that in contrast to those two, which have many side points and tangents that relativists can get off on and whatever, I'm just looking at this one per se in terms of a pragmatic argument to have some impact on relativists or new students, because it seems to be like a 1, 2, 3 step backed up by the empirical data. So I'm wondering if there's any problem with this argument per se. I'm just trying
Could I
to
just
add
ask-
this to our toolkit.
Could I just ask, because I wasn't quite clear, if your exposition there, Nick, was merely to do with velocity effects, and then you say the fastest clock would be in the preferred frame. I mean, if you're talking about gravitational effects on moving clocks, well, then I'm not quite sure whether it would be the opposite, whether the slowest clock might be in the preferred frame.
Yeah, what I said, yeah, that hole should be fixed up, but I did say disregarding gravitational potential, assuming that other things are equal.
Okay, I did say that at the beginning, but I wasn't sure if you'd carry that through.
Yeah, I should have done it more explicit at the end. Yeah, carried that point through.
Can
Nick,
you,
are you going to present different, you're talking about 3 parts. Are you going to present the other 2 parts in this half-hour segment, or are we going to have different half-hour segments?
It depends entirely on how long this one takes.
I think this is going to take a full half-hour.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. If we look just focusing on do those 1, 2, 3 steps, are they valid, or have I done something wrong here? Or as Ian points out, there's a little hole there, so I should plug that up and be a little more explicit and carry through the first point.
I think the issue is, as long as you use the terminology of relativity, you're not going to get anywhere. That would be my observation, because you talk about frames, okay, and GPS. I don't know that GPS talks about frames. Frame means inertial frame, and GPS is not in inertial. Well, they claim that the ECI is an inertial frame, but that's only just a hypothesis, because we know the ECI is in orbit around the sun, so it can't really be an inertial frame.
Well, kind of it can, because they were clever enough to say that anything falling can be included as an inertial frame.
That sort of opens up another problem. So now
Yes.
there are 2 issues that I see. One is special relativity doesn't apply to the real world. And so you have to have general relativity to apply to the real world. And then the question is, does that really? But so I think basically the point of what you're saying, and I think you start from a different philosophical position, which answers what Bill and the other people have said. You're looking at this purely from the point of view of the physical reality that we know exists,
Yes.
which is we live on the Earth orbits around the sun, and we have this thing called GPS. And this thing called GPS only agrees with relativity from the point of view of that there's a gravitational effect that is compensated in GPS. And other than that, relativity is completely not applicable to GPS.
Right.
So therefore, we don't need that as a theory at all. That would seem to me a better approach.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm just looking at this as a quick, pragmatic way. If you just focus on this argument, can it have impact on people like new students in physics?
Yeah, you're basically evangelizing.
Yeah, I'm trying to, rather than get into some of the fundamental arguments, which I agree with completely, because for the past 115 years, they haven't had an effect. Try to come up with something that's really pragmatic and is easily understood, and there aren't that many ways to wriggle out of it.
Well, you're starting from the position that relativity is what you're trying to basically dissolve or say is incorrect.
Yes. I mean,
and that assumes that the student has a knowledge of that.
Yeah.
And I would say that your better argument or audience are students who have no knowledge of relativity, and you just start from a blank slate position and say, okay, this is the way the world works, okay, from the physical point of view, and we don't need this absurd illusion of a theory that basically is based on incorrect mathematics and incorrect physical interpretations of experiments.
Right.
Nick mentioned his best guess as to what might be a preferred frame. I'd like to ask Nick if he has any idea as to what data we might collect to verify that guess or hypothesis.
Okay, GPS uses the Earth-centered inertial frame as the local preferred frame.
Well, I don't think you need to use the word preferred frame. You just say the Earth is the frame.
Yeah, I actually don't like the word frames. I like the word entity.
I don't
Most
think you need the
velocity
word-
with respect to a physical entity, a preferred physical entity.
Well,
Which-
all you have to do is say the Earth defines the physics. The center of the Earth and its motion around the sun defines the physical system of GPS.
Yes,
That's all you need to say. I think saying preferred frame is like a red cape in front of a bull.
yeah. Yeah, I like to get away from preferred frame too. and go to-
Well, can you explain the decay of gravity and
Oh, no.
how the Earth expands
Yeah,
due to the
that's
decay of
way out.
gravity?
That's way outside of this argument. I'm just trying to look for a pragmatic, simple to understand, hard to shoot down argument against special relativity.
And following from the earlier discussion, if you use the term preferred frame, well, I think, for a person who's studied somewhat the subject, it might seem to indicate that you're really, becoming a geocentrist. Because he would say to you, what is the preferred frame? Is it sort of this idealized system in which no motion occurs? Or you would say, no, it's the Earth. Well, then it appears that you're just, solipsist in a way, or a
What'd be wrong with
geocentrist.
that, Ian?
There may be nothing wrong with it, but then, physically, Harry, we would look and we would say, suppose you have somebody on Mars. Well, would he agree that the preferred frame is the Earth, or would he think that it's actually
Yeah.
Mars?
I always qualify it as in the vicinity of the Earth. The ECI frame is the preferred frame, a preferred physical entity.
I think this demonstrates the issues that have cropped up as a result of relativity, which is all of these metaphysical ideas that are prevalent in relativity and in physics that basically, you're essentially trying to say, let's just look at the physical situation. What do we know from the experiments? And GPS is sort of essentially it sort of is an amalgam of, we're going to use some relativity ideas, but we're going to verify them experimentally.
Right. Well, this
So
is
what they did was they sent rockets up and measured the change in clock rates when the rockets went up. And therefore they said, oh, okay, we see that the rate of the clock changes with altitude above the surface of the Earth. And so, okay, we need to put that into our GPS system.
Right.
See, it's a convenient system for using GPS and making other observations because we're based on the Earth. But I mean, I would say that you can you can measure the motion of the Earth and the spin of the Earth, in various ways by optical means and by looking at the anisotropy of the background radiation and that sort of thing. So I would sort of say that actually the preferred frame, if such exists, is actually the universe at large, where no motion occurs.
Well, this goes back to one thing that Einstein said that I think is correct, and he said that all physics is local. So and I think I'm with Harry about, let's not talk about frames, because that is sometimes quite confusing or misleading. So it's motion with respect to some local physical entity that seems to be the key for this phenomenon of clock slowing, which in turn is atomic process slowing.
Well, it's motion relative to the center of gravity of the Earth.
Right. And that's well, actually, I think it is even motion with respect to the gravitational field, whatever that is.
That's a little abstract.
I know, but it may be abstract because we don't have enough knowledge at the point, but
Can I say something as a newbie?
sure.
First question and a comment.
Oh.
First the comment. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I don't like this term preferred frame. In all my thinking about relativity over the past 40 years, I prefer, no pun intended, prefer the term prototype reference frame or primordial reference frame. We know that if you're talking about an inertial reference frame or a series of inertial reference frames, you must have a model or a definition of what the primordial or prototype frame is, the one that defines all of your system of inertial reference frames. Whether that prototype is a frame at rest with the ether or at rest with the earth, you have to have a prototype reference frame from which you can define all of your other inertial reference frames. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So-
but
I use the term prototype or primordial inertial reference frame.
Okay, to me, that's a little bit misleading in that I'm thinking of this as local physics. In other words, you're moving with respect to something physical, local physical. That seems to be what GPS is showing. So I try to even get rid of the word frame. And, I do think that the terms primordial and prototype are a bit misleading. They tend to give some extra weight to the mathematical construct of a frame, whereas what's really happening is you're moving with respect to something that's causing a physical effect. And by the way, it isn't time rate that's changing, it's atomic process that's changing.
I've looked at Jeff Amenko's writings a lot in the past. I haven't studied them seriously, but in one of his books, he analyzes certain types of clocks and says that there's several different types. Some will speed up and some will slow down with motion, according to Jeff Amenko. So I'd like to go back and revisit that and study what he says.
Yeah, that's why
Said.
I qualified it as an atomic clock, because I've done an experiment or mental experiment where, an hourglass clock will do the opposite of an atomic clock. So, yeah.
Dingle said that in the 1930s.
Yeah, right.
What did he say?
He went and published a paper that caused quite a stir because he showed that different clocks, if you applied the theory of relativity to the different types of clocks, you get contradictory results, that they all didn't keep the same time. They all didn't agree.
Right.
And that caused a big controversy. Oh, they didn't like that.
Yeah, I hadn't read that, but I just did a Gedanken experiment, and it was clear that.
Yeah, one of the examples was an hourglass clock that he used, and he said, well, if I do the relativistic transformation of mass and apply that to an hourglass clock, the transformation of time doesn't agree with the Lorentz transformation. And they didn't like that at all. They called it, it caused a big, I have a paper on it on the GSJ where I talk about the controversy that's caused. I mean, they really hated this. And that was one of the things that got him into the doghouse with the science community.
See, they say that time itself slows down, and therefore any of these mechanical or atomic corrections that one would care to mention would be second order things. Primarily, they say time slows down or speeds up, and
right. And Dingle kind of blew that away by showing that different clocks came up with different transformations of time, and so it depended upon the clock that you used as to what relativistic transformation of time you got as a result. And of course, they didn't like that because that kind of blew away their whole thesis that, all I need to prove relativity is a clock.
And to boost the reciprocity is a major problem, as Dingle pointed out. Although perhaps if you get to the Fitzgerald-Lorenz system, which presumably applies to time as well, you might have a problem, but you don't have that problem, because you don't have, simultaneously one thing being greater and lesser than another thing.
It's interesting that Lorenz referred to it as clock retardation
Well, that's
rather
physically
than
correct.
time retardation or whatever.
Einstein basically introduces metaphysics into
Yeah.
to the physical discourse, and that's really basically, because he talks about time and space in a metaphysical sense. He's not talking about, the physical concept of doing a physical measurement. For him, physical measurements aren't part of this theory. He just uses them to explain his metaphysical concept that time and space change.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if
We're into the philosophy of the whole thing, which is, kind of Einstein messed up metaphysics of physics, and and the measurement, and it's just a gigantic mess. And so trying to establish a way of reference point of talking, which is what you're doing. You're trying to say, let's return to the actual physics of what we're talking about, rather than introduce these metaphysical ideas like frames of reference and clocks that don't really exist, and
time.
events, et cetera, et cetera. That's all metaphysical stuff that led them into this morass of confusion they currently have.
Right.
But SRT itself does talk about things like proper time, which is seems very, very close to a sort of a preferred time, or almost what you're talking about.
No. Proper time is identified with each and every clock individually. There's no preferred thing. It's
but the clock is a metaphysical idea. You got what I'm saying there? When Einstein says a proper time measured by a clock, that clock is metaphysical. It's not a physical clock. It's just an idea in the mind.
Yeah, Tom Phipps used to talk about a clock gas. Like, if every point is a clock.
Right. It's all metaphysical ideas that are basically given physical reality by the use of the word clock or measuring rod.
So can I ask my question? I don't think I ever got a chance to ask it.
I'm sorry.
So for those of us who do not accept Einstein's special relativity, does the GPS system of these satellites, does it, quote, prove or disprove Einstein's special relativity?
All right, let me answer this, because I talked to Ron Hatch, who had 30 patents in for GPS. One, the assumption was that by the people who originally built and designed and sold GPS was that it would be based on special relativity and general relativity. However, the data shows that while general relativity's prediction that clock rate is a function of gravitational potential is consistent with the GPS data, the assertion by special relativity that clock rate or time is a function of relative velocity has been disproved categorically without possible refutation, because there's a single inertial frame where you measure velocity, and if you take another inertial frame, you'll send people into the river and lakes and other, backyards. So it's absolute velocity, and absolute velocity is measured from the gravitational field, or the center of the Earth, non-rotating center of the Earth.
And who did you talk to? I'd like to talk to this person or read some of his papers.
Yeah, you'll have to read his papers. He passed away last year or the previous fall. It's Ron Hatch, Hatch, who had over 30 patents for building the GPS system, and he knew the GPS data, I believe, better than anyone in the world. He was quite familiar with the NASA data, the BBLI data, and the data from these high precision pulsars.
But he did leave a paper trail that I can look up?
Yes, yes.
2007 physics essays. He has a paper that the title is A New Theory of Gravity, and then some other words. But it starts out A New Theory of Gravity. It's Physics Essays, 2007.
David, I'll try and send you a couple of papers.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
This would seem a more fruitful means of trying to persuade the ordinary person, maybe, because we're not merely making a claim, you know, a new claim. We're making the opposite claim to what the mainstream make. I mean, the ordinary person, I mean, the ordinary reasonably educated person, but not specialist, says, oh, GPS proves that special theory of relativity is true.
Yes,
now,
yes.
we're saying the exact opposite. And this would seem a very fruitful means of maybe trying to put this in a simpler language, Nick, rather than, you know, the sort of more abstruse concepts that some of which you've been using, I think.
Yes, not only, it's not we who are saying it, it's Ron Hatch, one of the key designers of the GPS system and a person who is recognized as an expert in navigation and knows the data extremely well, or used to.
And Ron's papers are very respectable and academic and so on. But I'm saying that rather than just quote him, if we could actually get the essence of what he is saying into simpler language, and use that to influence people. If that could be done, I think that would be quite. You know,
and if I give this presentation again, it's going to be to much less knowledgeable people. Maybe I was. Oh, it'll stop. Maybe I was talking so fast that it slowed down time. I don't know. By the way, not having a particle accelerator handy, I did a very interesting experiment. I put one banana into a refrigerator and another banana on the counter. And 2 weeks later, I came and the one in the refrigerator had decayed less. And that profound result shows the time goes slower in the refrigerator. Time is dependent on temperature. I expect to win the Nobel Prize from this discovery.
Yeah, good one.
Again, we will give a short argument that shows why we need to move from the relativistic view to the physical and absolute view. We have to do that for two reasons. One, to be in sync with what the empirical data is showing us, and number two, to give an accurate view of what's happening physically. Okay, this first bullet is the same as we used last time, and it's a very important point. I've used it for decades, but I haven't seen it used by other people, but it's a very useful fact when you're debating this issue or trying to construct logical arguments. The empirical data shows that all clocks at rest in the same frame, other things being equal, such as gravitational potential, have the same clock rate. And again, because that's a fact, the International Standards Committee is able to define standards for time, such as the standard for a second. All right, the second bullet says, special relativity claims that all frames are indistinguishable. And note that the velocity or state of motion defines a frame. Okay, let's look at the third bullet. But we're going to assume that the special relativity time dilation can explain physical clock rate changes as a function of velocity, and see where that assumption leads. We're going to show that it leads to a contradiction. Okay, applying that assumption, we look at bullet 3. If we take a clock from frame A and move it to frame B, both frames being in deep space, then we'd have changed that clock's velocity and hence its clock rate. So when the clock goes from frame A to frame B, it'll have a different clock rate when it's at rest in frame B than it had when it was in frame A. But from the first bullet, clock rate is a property of a frame. So that would make frame A and frame B distinguishable one from the other, because they'd have different inherent clock rates. And that's a contradiction, because special relativity is built on the claim that all frames are indistinguishable. Okay, we're going to look at a similar argument on this topic, but it actually makes a different point. So you're going to get two arguments for the price of one today. Same topic, but, well, we're going to keep the first two bullets. We're not going to go over them again, but in case you haven't committed them to memory, just for convenience, so you won't have to rewind to the previous slide, we'll have them there for reference. Again, we'll look at the third bullet. And again, we're going to say, let's assume that special relativity's time dilation can explain physical clock rate changes as a function of velocity, and see where that leads. And again, we're going to see it leads to a contradiction. Okay, if we take a clock from frame A and move it to frame B, and then move it back to frame A, it will have undergone, according to special relativity's time dilation, if applied consistently, two cumulative clock slowings. The first going from A to B, and the second from B to A. But that would make it slower than other clocks in A, which contradicts the first bullet, which is established by the empirical data, that all clocks in frame A need to be going at the same rate. And again, frame A and frame B are in deep space, they have no other influences, so velocity would be the only variable. So again, we've given arguments that show we need to go from the relativistic to the absolute in order to see what's really happening physically. And it also happens that we need to do that to match the empirical data. And if the relativist is willing to accept the empirical data and go into the critical thinking mode, he'll have to come to these same conclusions. So, okay, sorry about, this is our third short. Sorry about the screen that popped up from OneDrive that cluttered up the screen. Hopefully you could get the gist of the argument.
Nick, I recognize this argument. I think this has been hashed out before and by Einstein and his critics back way back in the beginning. I think this has been a point of controversy before.
Well, I don't know if the point about all clocks move at the same rate in the same frame, other things being equal, has been used before. And to me,
Well-
that's a great, that really, I think, cuts through a lot of
My point I'm making,
tangential
Nick, is I
arguments.
think this is a controversy that's already out there in the literature.
Okay,
And I'm not really sure how Einstein got around it. But I recall there was this discussion, I think about 1911. There was and then I think it's in some of the literature, but I'm not real sure which papers exactly. So I would point out to you that this has already been brought up as an objection. I'm pretty sure that it has.
okay.
To me, it
Okay,
seems
let me just make
reminiscent.
a general comment. I would say all of the comments by James and Bill would apply to this argument as well. What I was looking for was what's a nice 1, 2, 3 simple, straightforward argument, and this is argument number 2. By the
I
way,
think a relativist would argue that in order to change from one frame to another, you have to introduce acceleration, and then that causes a change in the time on the clocks. And
yeah,
so
but that's what the
therefore-
first bullet rebuts.
Well, but I'm just saying, as I recall this discussion previously, and I've read about this.
Yeah.
I personally think that it's kind of a devastating argument, but I think, it might be convincing for somebody that doesn't know that much about relativity. For an expert, might say, "Oh, well, Einstein disposed of this argument," and blah 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 blah.
I think you find that the first bullet rebuts the acceleration argument.
All right. Well, I'm just pointing that out.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with Harry. This is essentially the twin paradox, and people try to explain the twin paradox, by invoking acceleration. So I agree with Harry. There's been endless arguments about the twin paradox in the literature.
Yeah, it
Right.
is rather reminiscent of the twin paradox, where there's a net difference in time when the traveling twin comes back. But actually, the acceleration argument is the one frequently cited, but there are about 30 or more other arguments which have been given actually to try to explain this apparent contradiction. And I think that you've really just raised this again, perhaps, Nick.
Right. Well, I think since I've studied the twin paradox for about 50 years and written about it endlessly, I know it pretty well. And this is a much simpler version that gets rid of the acceleration counter argument. So I happen to like it. Obviously, we tend to like our own presentations.
I think it points to a big problem, and I have my own ideas about this, and it's kind of complicated to explain what my view is. So I'll just let you guys discuss onward. We'll talk about my position in a different session, I guess.
My cat has just joined me and agrees with me, much like Kent Mayhew's dog.
The cats have a different sensation of time, I want you to know.
Yes. I mean, this has been eye-opening for me because, I certainly didn't think that I would present one of these to academia and everyone would say, "Oh, yes, now I see." But I see a whole lot of complications arising when I thought I had reduced it to real simplicity. I don't know if there's any argument specific to the 1, 2, 3 argument that needs to be taken care of. We know that the relativist can come up with a counter argument, whether there's one or not, but anything that strikes you as being particularly wrong or needs to be mentioned about the particular 1, 2, 3 step presented?
Well, I used to work for NOAA, and I was in the laboratory that controlled and got the data from all the satellites, military every type of satellite the US put up. And one of the problems we had was special and general relativity could not predict the orbits of the satellites, and they were losing track of the satellites, and they didn't know where they were. And and also people in Asia started doing experiments, and in Russia too, I think, that showed that there's a temperature dependence
Yes.
to gravity. And that is not explained by relativity. And but it is explained, interestingly enough, by electrodynamics. If you use electrodynamics instead of relativity, you can explain all of that data that has been measured. And but the scientific community does not want that. When I presented that to a meeting of the American Physical Society in Washington, D.C., I was the guest speaker. And when I presented that from the work that I had done at NOAA, they did not like it. And they asked to have me fired from Catholic University where I was working.
Remember this story, yeah.
By the way, GPS data shows that clock rate is also dependent on temperature and pressure, in addition to velocity and gravitational
That's right.
potential.
And you don't.
So the physics of clock rates and what we think of as time is just dependent on a whole lot of physical variables, local physical variables.
Charles, could you explain what you mean by temperature dependence of gravity?
Well, I am besides being a scientist, I'm a creation scientist, so some religious part there. And the Earth is expanding, and the Navy, they took sonar logs in their ships, and they were able to make a map of all the oceans of the world to fairly high resolution using all these thousands of sonar maps that had been made. And so when you do that, you can see the stretch marks for the expansion of the Earth, and you can see where the continents used to be connected, and you can see that the properties of the two continents where they used to be connected are the same. In other words, the same type of mountains and hills, the same type of animals, all that kind of stuff. And so there was a lot going on there, and but there's politics in our science today, and if you're not in agreement with the politics, they try to make it financially very difficult for you.
I'm also a creation science person. I'm on the board of directors of the Creation Studies Institute.
Well, I run an organization called Common Sense Science, which is science based on logic. And the current scientific method, the existential scientific method, does not use logic properly. And they did it deliberately so they could make theories to fit any criteria they wanted to.
I agree with you.
So
David, in the emails that I sent to you, in the list of past talks, there's Bill's talk from last Saturday that I would highly recommend to you. I think you would find it very interesting.
Great.
So you can click on that and get a replay.
Get back to your presentation. My comment is, I think that the experimental evidence disproves the first assumption that you make, that the inertial frames are the same. The clock rates aren't the same in every inertial frame, and that's essentially what the Lorentz transformation tells us, okay, and what GPS tells us. And that is, it's not true to say that all clocks have the same rate in every inertial frame. And so therefore they're not all equivalent. There has to be some frame that is the zero frame.
Yeah, it's just that the effective temperature and pressure is in GPS is, you know, secondary below the gravitational potential and velocity, at least velocity of an orbiting satellite and the velocity of the spinning Earth. But I guess I agree with you that talking about frames is improper, and I prefer talking about the local conditions that a clock or whatever is experiencing locally. And I think we can forget about temperature and pressure for now to get on firmer ground, and then bring those two things in later.
Right. My other suggestion would be you need a definition of what a clock is.
Right. I talk about, I first went to proper time, and then I went one step lower, and I talk about processes.
Right.
All clocks are driven by physical processes and not driven by time.
Well, Dingle, you know, essentially one of the things that he did was he basically attacked the relativity on the basis from this whole idea that there's really no definition of a clock, according to Einstein. It's just this metaphysical idea, you know, all clocks have the same rate in all inertial frames. That's just a metaphysical concept. Show me a set of clocks that actually you can make do that. No, you can't. It's not anything practical that an engineer can build or test or experiment with. GPS is something that we can build, that has been built, and engineers have experimented with. Okay. And to do that, you have to have a lot of clock technology, which, you know, gets into Essen, who didn't like special relativity. And if you look at his criticisms of special relativity, that's coming from a guy who knows how you make a clock. And he said it was BS. So, this is all this stuff about, you know, a clock is a physical thing. So it needs, it doesn't really measure time. It only measures time when it's set in a certain condition that allows it to do that. It has to have a stable oscillator, and the oscillator has to be set to the right frequency that keeps time with the second, as the second is defined according to the standards. And if it's not really a clock.
Well, I might mention to Harry, and I think it would be interesting to Bill too, that my presentation on my YouTube channel entitled Surprise Ending really speaks to that, where I get rid of the construct of time and replace it by the construct of processes and process length. But that's another whole topic altogether.
And of course, and sorry to interrupt, of course, in addition to clock rates, you have the difficult subject of clock synchronization. So once you resolve this whole issue of the rates of the clocks, then you have to decide how you're going to synchronize them, and that opens up a bag of worms.
Yes, it does. In fact, Einstein's synchronization is another error.
Yes, but luckily I worked in the field of where we solved this with the PRN code, and so you can, you know, GPS solved that problem. And that's one of the miracles of GPS. And of course, as David, you're correct in pointing that out, but that's one of the things that GPS solved. That's really a big step technologically forward for the solve.
They have de facto absolute synchronization.
Right, there's absolute time.
Yeah, to the degree that, you know, GPS precision works. Okay, well,
Can I make another comment?
sure.
So we're all, I believe, anti-Einstein special relativity. And the only thing that makes me sometimes doubt my convictions that Einstein was wrong was the fact that you had two other really smart people come up with similar theories, i.e. Poincaré and Lorentz. And sometimes I wonder if their variations of the theory might represent truth. And I'd like to consider not only what Einstein would have to say about the subject, but what Poincaré and what Lorentz would have to say about the subject.
Well, before Einstein came around, I think Lorentz had the right solution, which, for one thing, it was velocity with respect to the ether that was supposed to cause clock retardation and length contraction of the moving object. And then what Einstein did was use that theory, not including the ether, of course, just a preferred frame. Each observer who uses special relativity sees the world as though he is in the Lorentz ether theory preferred frame.
It's all very interesting talking about this ourselves, but I'm a little pessimistic. You know, I don't know if we're trying to influence the ordinary man on the street or academia. Louis Essen and Herbert Dingle, you know, were, and Ron Hatch you mentioned. I mean, these are recognized experts in the area,
Yes.
but they were thrown down. So, I don't think we'll have much success. But anyway, I don't want to be too negative about things.
No, I agree with you 100%.
Oh, Bill's
That's why I
correct
was
when he says
searching.
Science is political. I mean, I think we know that science is political.
Yeah.
They don't want to basically admit that they've been wrong for over 100 years. That's something real tough for them to do.
Yeah.
They don't even use the term science. They use the term the science. Well,
yeah,
the science is political. That's just politics.
It seems that the phrase "the science" shows they aren't using the scientific method, because the scientific method says, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and by this process, we'll find out which is the most fragrant and beautiful flower.
This is an interesting subject, is the sociology of science, and who is it that actually determines what science will declare to be true?
Apparently the government.
The people with money.
Well, there are authorities, yes, the academia, the government, the politicians, the media even, they're all in it together, and they're all giving a narrative which you daren't contradict.
Yes, you have to have the academic credentials. And by the way, if you're a heretic like Bill Lucas, then you get fired, so you won't get the academic credentials. And therefore can be viewed and dismissed as someone on the outside.
Well, besides the existential scientific method, we now are in what's called the postmodern scientific method, which means that we have separate silos for science. So we have one for chemistry, we have one for physics, one for biology, one for geology, one for astronomy. And what is proved in one silo does not get disproved or proved in another silo. So they keep them separate like that, so that, for instance, when they found that the force of gravity was a function of the temperature, they didn't have that, they couldn't explain that. And so and this was done by chemists. So they put that in the chemist silo, and so the silos don't agree with one another, and they have plenty of data. And if you talk about it in the wrong place, you get fired. And so that's what we have to deal with. But many of us are not working in multiple silos. And if you were working in multiple silos, you could see this.
Well, I think we moved beyond postmodern. I think we're post-science now. Anyways, that we're getting a little bit off track there. So we can do a part 3, and I can show you the essence of the argument. But the third one has a little bit of a different twist to it. So I'll see if that is a catalyst to any different thoughts.
This is our third short argument about why we need a description of the physical world. We're going to show that special relativity's symmetric equations do not describe the physical world. A relativist may say, well, gee, I never claimed that special relativity described the physical world. Good, we're in agreement. But, as we've shown earlier from, for example, GPS data, that shows that we have physical clock slowing as a function of absolute velocity. We can see what's really happening physically, and the special relativity view does not describe the physics of what's happening physically. That's the point we're making. Okay, again, as we've done before, we'll start off the discussion by assuming that special relativity does describe the physical world, and we will reach a contradiction, and in that way prove our point that special relativity does not describe the physical world directly or describe what's happening physically. First point, special relativity claims that all inertial observers' views are equally valid. Second point, let's take a frame that is moving at a velocity relative to our sun that's arbitrarily close to the speed of light. Let's say it's within 1 part in 100 million of the speed of light. In the context of special relativity's length contraction and mass increase as a function of velocity, the frame's velocity, the observer's frame velocity, the depth of our sun, and hence its volume, would contract to be arbitrarily small, and its mass would increase to be arbitrarily large, and hence our sun's density would become arbitrarily great. Okay, we have to go to the next slide to continue the argument. That arbitrarily great density implies that the sun would become a neutron star or a black hole, but it isn't. That frame has a view that's inconsistent with physical reality. So in the context of special relativity and the context of all frames have equally valid views, we come to an inconsistency if we're assuming that the frame's view describe physical reality. Okay, let's do a little critical thinking here. Let's say a relativist immediately replies, because he wants to defend his strongly held belief system. Let's say he says gravity and neutron stars and black holes are outside the domain of special relativity. Well, that's not a relevant counter-argument, because we're showing that the view of this hypothetical frame is inconsistent with physical reality. Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether that aspect of physical reality is within the domain of special relativity. It the view is inconsistent with physical reality. Last point. Or the relativist might say, but I interpret special relativity as describing the just observed and not physical effects. Again, that's not a counter argument, that's an agreement with what we've been proving. The point is that if special relativity is confined to the just observed and not physical effects, we now see from the data that that's a limitation on special relativity, because the empirical data is saying that beneath the special relativity view that's presented is a deeper view, a view that describes the physics of the physical world and a view of what's actually happening physically. So again, in conclusion, we've shown that special relativity is not describing the physical world directly, and that's an important point.
Okay, any comment?
But it's an interesting argument that relativity just describes what is observed and not actual reality.
Well, the symmetric nature of the equations would suggest that it's just observed, because otherwise you'd agree with Dingle that special relativity predicts that clock A is slower than clock B, and clock B is physically slower than clock A. So, but the point is, if your claim that special relativity does directly describe the physical world, this is a counter argument, because the frame that's moving arbitrarily fast with respect to the sun would view the sun as having shrunk and become such a density that physically it would go into being a neutron star or a black hole. But that is not an accurate view of physical reality.
Could
The
you
sun does
describe,
not have that density physically. It's just a distorted view from using special relativity.
could you describe what just observed is again, please? And how it's different from a physical event?
Yeah, when people are presented with a Dingle argument or an argument like this, they say, well, special relativity does not describe what's physically happening. It just gives a description of how each observer observes the world. And I would tend to, at best, to say that that's true, and that view or that interpretation of special relativity would agree that special relativity does not describe the physical world. But the just observed is like when you have two twins and they separate physically, each will observe the other as shrinking, but there's no physical shrinking involved. That's a just observed effect.
It has to do with the relativity of simultaneity.
Yes.
So that's their universal get out of jail card. And, you know, it's kind of a nasty thing.
But as you mentioned earlier, Harry, GPS has in fact implemented absolute simultaneity.
Well, right. And, you know, but the whole relativity of simultaneity thing is really, that's really the ace in the hole card for relativity, because, you know, you can explain anything away by saying, well, you know, it's because the events aren't simultaneous. And so therefore, you know, the measurement, you know, it's not really real, but we say it's real because we say so. And I don't know. I did want to comment on your presentation there. I think Dingle sort of is basically pretty much done most of the groundwork for all these arguments that you're making. And, you know, the I.J. Good, I you know, wrote some papers at the GSJ. You know, there's this General Science Journal. And at the GSJ, I wrote a series of papers called Herbert Dingle Was Correct. And one of them I deal with I.J. Good. He really basically uses this, what you call just observed argument. So what happens if you try to prove by saying the two clocks can't, you know, Dingle said, well, it's impossible for two clocks both to run slower than the other. You know, he said, that's obvious logic. And of course, the relativists come back, I.J. Good being the most recent, and they say, oh, that's not really what we meant. It's just an observed effect, but they don't really say it that way. It's just, you know, so what, you know, this has all been, you know, ground around and you know, so they'll just, all they have to do basically to refute you is say, point to some paper by somebody else. You know, I.J. Good refuted this argument and blah, 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 physics essay, volume, whatever. And, you know, and then that's the end for them. You know, they don't really have to explain any more than just saying that argument has already been refuted.
Yes, and Harry, that brings up, you mentioned I.J. Good, and I would just like to relate something.
Yeah.
I came up after arguing with 50 years, being a quick learner. I decided that nothing I would say would convince a relativist that my point was correct. So I got into a dialogue with I.J. Good, where I made no arguments. I just asked him about his model of special relativity. And as we got, after about 20 questions, we came within one step of him showing that his argument had a contradiction, at which time he claimed he had to go off and do his taxes. He not only never came back, and he lived a couple more years, he never again wrote any arguments against Dingle.
Well, they'd already been published in physics essays.
Yeah, he did, nor did he argue against.
Well, my comment on I.J. Good is I'm embarrassed that he was a professor at Virginia Tech, and I'm embarrassed to be a graduate of Virginia Tech. Oh my God, I'm in horror of that. And I forgot what the other comment was.
I.J. Good wasn't good.
Yeah. I got sent some of, I went to Virginia Tech, and I think he died by this point, and asked them for copies of his technical papers. He apparently wrote some, quote, tech manuals or, you know, internal documents, and they sent them to me, but they were basically just preliminaries of what he got published in physics essays. But he was a mathematician and not a physicist, so that's how I dismiss his arguments. He knows nothing about physics.
Well, I must say, I think we have a very convivial group here today, and it's definitely been enjoyable to banter about.
I see Franklin, who has joined us.
Oh, hi, Franklin.
Well, Roger hasn't said anything. Roger, do you have something to say?
I'm just glad you guys are keeping this up here. So good job. Oh, gang, I love it.
Roger basically says that Nick is right. So anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I'd like to say something. According to David D. Hilster, and I've heard this from other people too, there are senior scientists at SLAC that said it used to be the linear accelerator. Now they've redefined it a little bit to include some other stuff. But they have a huge linear accelerator at Stanford. It's called, used to be called SLAC, S-L-A-C. And they claim that mass increased with velocity is an illusion. And they base their argumentation, I think, on the fact that their accelerator is a straight shot. It's a linear one. You know, things just go right down the line in a straight line. Whereas at CERN, I think they have it in a figure eight. The stuff is going around in a figure eight, which means that they have to include all sorts of strange relativistic effects like Thomas precession, for example. And all of which seem to hang together pretty much, but it's hard to say that they're actually correct. Whereas if you're going right straight down the line in a linear accelerator, it seems to me, even though your accelerator may not be as expensive or as powerful as CERN's, you should be given the benefit of the doubt because it's so much simpler. You don't have to, wave as many magic wands to come up with the answer that they get. You know, it's the calculation is relatively straightforward with a linear accelerator, whereas with something that's going in a figure eight, I mean, who knows?
Well, I'll add something to that. The reason they think special relativity is correct is that the Lorentz clock retardation and length contraction equations look mathematically identical to special relativity's time dilation and length contraction equations. It's just that in the former, it's absolute velocity, whereas in the latter, it's relativistic or relative velocity. So one can use Lorentz theory to come to the correct answer and think that one's using special relativity. Similarly, if you're in the preferred frame of Lorentz theory, then special relativity, the results will be consistent with special relativity. That's the one frame where special relativity, if you use it consistent with special relativity, will provide the correct answer.
Talking about accelerators, one point that I've made is that at higher energies, where they're talking about proton beams, for example, it's really not protons anymore. It's better called a soup because the energy density is so high. And yet at CERN, and I'm not sure at SLAC, but they continue to call them proton beams even up to above 13 TeV energy. So that's been my critique, that they don't even know how to name the beams that they're using. They're calling them, falsely calling them proton beams, when all information indicates that they are in fact better characterized as what we call a SOUP, S-O-U-P. Sometimes called a quark gluon soup.
Let's go back to your presentation. I thought that your third presentation started out, you should have said at the beginning of the third presentation what you should have said at the beginning of the first presentation.
Yes. Oh, it doesn't talk about physical reality?
Well, I thought the introduction was a little better, but the point is that you're trying to say that we're talking about physics and physical reality, and we're not messing around with metaphysical theories, which basically special relativity is a metaphysical theory. Okay, it's all about, you know, space and time and changes in time and space. And then it says things like mass changes. And then it turns out SLAC says, no, it's not really true. Mass doesn't really change. That's kind of confusing. Yeah, and they talk about that on Wikipedia. I find it confusing how they say that that's not really true. You know, it's kind of like, you know, I thought that was one of the main predictions of special relativity, but then they say, no, that's not really true. That's all confusing. It's all a metaphysical soup, I think.
Well, Dennis didn't mention it, but besides SLAC saying there's no mass increase, they also said the first thing they do is unteach special relativity.
Right. I wanted to make this point. This is all done in David's film. And I wanted to mention David's film earlier. How many people here have seen David's film?
Einstein wrong. Yeah, I have seen it, yes.
That's kind of, in my opinion, kind of a prerequisite. You know, I would say, you know, the first thing you could do is, you know, show people that film by David. You know, it's really well done. It's got this catchy song. And, you know, it seems like that's, you know, and Ron Hatch is actually interviewed in that film.
Yes, a catchy song really impresses physicists.
It's a real catchy. I don't know. Can you still watch that film? I don't know whether is it posted somewhere.
I'm sure it is. I can't give the link right now, but a year or two I looked at it again. Yeah.
I had to purchase it, or at least, you know, input some sum to be able to watch it once. I think I did about a year or two ago as well.
Yeah, I have a review of it, I believe, on the CNPS website. I don't.
You might go to YouTube and enter into the search box Einstein wrong. I think you'd come up with it.
That'd be interesting to try. Okay, I'm going to make a few comments here about my paper, irksomeness of Einstein's special relativity. You know, one of the things that kind of bugs me is Einstein's example of his theory, where he talks about a clock at the equator will run slower than a clock at the pole.
That's right, because general relativity had not been created yet.
Well, there's no way special relativity says that, because there's no motion between a clock at the equator and the clock at the pole other than the rotation of the Earth, which implies that it's absolute motion.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
And so now you have this problem of Einstein mixes up absolute motion and relative motion in his predictions. So what I think is a problem is that, you know, the relativists, they don't really know there's a difference. And because they've messed it up in their minds, because Einstein had it messed up. So all they have to do is go point to some of Einstein's mistakes and say, what, Einstein predicted this. You see what I'm driving at here?
Right. But let me just add one thing, and that is that it was something we were talking about earlier about this argument about velocity. Basically, Einstein around 1916 gave up his claim about the twin paradox claim about the round trip and explained it in terms of general relativity, and that the acceleration was like a virtual gravitational field. And
right.
In fact, Max Born also subscribed to that. So argument number 1 and 2, or equivalent, actually did get to Einstein, and he did recant on the claim that time dilation, special relativity time dilation, causes physical asymmetric clock slowing. That gave up on that.
Yeah, because it was inconsistent with his postulate of relativity, so he had to.
Right. So I certainly give credit to Einstein for, you know, when the facts or logic is presented, he did change his tune and things. And that helps the relativists, because they can point to what Einstein said and he contradicts himself, but he did it in a positive evolutionary sense rather than.
There's so many contradictions in his theory that it's almost as if, you know, it's a theory of contradictions. You know, how can we make it, you know, legitimate in science to have a theory that's full of contradictions be accepted as a correct scientific theory? I mean, that's postmodern, you know, postmodern, post whatever. That's post logical science.
they make a virtue out of it. They say, you know, according to conventional logic, it would appear to be quite
Right.
inadmissible. But that was Einstein's genius, that he said conventional logic can go out the door.
Right. Well, well, it's not a theory of logic or physics, it's metaphysics. And anything is possible when you're in the metaphysical realm. That's my view of it. You can imagine anything you want to be true.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic when there were the great twin paradox debates that went on for quite some time. And academia was 100% against Dingle and pro-Einstein, except by that time, Einstein was agreeing with Dingle, at least about there would be a contradiction if you suggested that time dilation was talking about physical time slowing.
Well, you have to understand their motive. You know, there's in criminal justice, there's means, motive, and opportunity. Their motive was they wanted to keep special relativity because it made electrodynamics, relativistic electrodynamics, easier for the engineers and for themselves too, of course. In that, if you apply the Lorentz transform, you oftentimes get an answer that would take you 2 months of hard math to get otherwise.
But they weren't really using it consistent with the relativity model. They were using the equations.
But you can get any answer you want. I mean, his lecture in Leiden in the 1920s, where it appears that he's reinstating the ether, you know, should be considered perhaps as a revision. But then if one mentions the ether, what one is, you know, outside the fold, one is against Einstein, one is against Einstein's fundamental principles.
Yeah, I think that Einstein really was open-minded about his own theory and changed it when he saw there were problems.
He did, though, appear to be inadvertently hostile to any possible contradictions. For example, Miller's data. He was quite happy putting those down.
Well, yeah, you don't want to have the ether thing. That's an evil, wicked, horrible thing. You got to get rid of that.
It's too physical.
Yeah, it doesn't fit in with the metaphysical program.
No, they love the part where time merges into space and vice versa. That completely shoots down all the parts of Western civilization built on Judaism and then followed with Christianity. And when you say that time and space can merge, you're off in a different world.
Well, it's all metaphysics now.
Yeah.
So your question at the beginning, Nick, is really a legitimate one. What is the effective argument that you can make? And you know, from my view, I think all of the effective arguments have already been made and they've already been dismissed. So, I mean, many, many times. And so the real issue is, are we dealing with a convincing the people who've already decided that metaphysical reality is real because Einstein said so? Or are we dealing with, you know, where we have today is a world where people change words, you know, what is a woman, you know, it's whatever the person defines himself to be. If I want to define myself as a woman, I'm a woman, you know, that's,
yes.
that's you know, sort of you know, everything has become metaphysical and beyond any physical reality. And so in a world that, you know, in a world like this, what is the appeal of talking about a physical theory that refutes this metaphysical ideology that anything can be what we want it to be? We can conceive of time as changing because, you know, you're moving and I'm not moving. And so therefore your time is not my time, but it, you know, and how, is this really, is this really the issue disputing special relativity, or really is the issue that there's really a problem with what science is? I think it's the problem is what science is the problem, not what.
Yeah, so do I. Because I think these are all possible factors, contradictions, or, it suits them philosophically or whatever. But the problem we have today is that this is politics.
Yes.
This is established political wisdom. And,
Yes.
and it's very, very difficult to break that.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, we're basically the bad people because we're the unvaccinated. we're not with the science.
That's right. We're the untouchables. Yeah. I'm wondering, by the way, I don't know how long more we have, Nick, but if you should maybe spend a couple of minutes just finishing the sessions, rather than just have us cut off in about 5 minutes time.
Okay. I might call up Roger to praise all 3 sessions. What I was trying to do, Harry made a good point about what's the audience. Well, I agree the audience would have to be someone who had not already affirmed backward of special relativity. And that might have an impact on them. I'm hoping it would be a nice, quick, easy thing to remember. Regarding the having an effect on academia, I'm extremely skeptical, but it might serve as getting your foot in the door. In other words, you do a 1, 2, 3, and they'll come back with a rebuttal, but it may just be so hard for them to personally rebut it. And it's so simple to remember, and there's no real quick rebuttal. You could bring up tangential arguments, but you can't really rebut the core argument that it may be a foot in the door for academia. But this has been very educational for me, and I see that there may be no simple solution to the problem we're in. And with that,
Well, my comment would be, I think academia is a lost cause. My friend of mine who's a professor at the local college, every time we have a conversation, he tells me about how completely astounded he is at what the kids are being taught, and there's no discipline of logic. Everything, they've sucked up all this mythology, political mythology and stuff from elementary through high school, and then they get to college and they're still espousing all this, and it's kind of too late for an academic to actually say, okay, we're going to use logic and we're going to actually examine the facts. No, they're beyond that point by the time they get to college. I mean, that's too late.
yeah, it may soon be too late to influence any college graduate because,
Well, I mean, they've already been poisoned by the time they get to college. That's the point that my professor friend is saying, and I get the impression that he starts off his class, and starts talking to them, and what do you think about this? And, they all have these pre-programmed ideas that have already been fixed in concrete before they even arrive at college. It's all been put into their heads by the, education bureaucracy. And, they've taught not to be critical thinkers by the time they get to college. So everything about the education system, at least here in America, I don't know about other places, seems to be totally and completely opposed to the creation of a critical thinker.
Yeah. Well, I think we've.
You don't have to. You don't have any comments on how you think that would. How are you going to get around that?
Well, I think we may have flogged.
Oh, that Bill's got.
Bill.
Yes, I have the idea that the way we get a particular approach to these problems adopted is we have to have technology based on it that provides something that we need. So for instance, I've been working with Elon Musk, and we're getting ready to produce the first car that does not require any fuel, does not require any electrical batteries. It has a cosmic background radiation, kind of like a solar panel, but it's cosmic background radiation, works 24 hours a day. And it's 500 times as much energy per square inch. So with a 1 foot square solar panel, we can power a car for your lifetime. No recharging, no maintenance required. And the car could cost a whole lot less than they currently cost now, although they're probably going to charge more money for it because they want more money. And but anyway, that's one thing. The second thing is we could get by without any roads. We can use inertial propulsion, which is electromagnetic. And so this shows two things from electrodynamics that our current theory of electrodynamics does not explain. But the fact that it works is going to make a difference. And so
Yeah, right. So going back to the next thing, GPS works, so therefore it must be right. So that's kind of the first part of your argument. Okay, this is something that engineers have created and we know it works.
Yes, and but with this new technology we're using, you're going to have GPS on your, what you would call your spaceship or your car. Your car can go to the moon, your car can go to Mars, and you don't need anything other than a spacesuit to get in it, to go there. And it doesn't cost anything. And so people will be going there, particularly if they find gold, silver, or something that's valuable on these other planets. They're going to want to go and get it and get the value. And so that may have an impact on it, because people are going to see it and they say, well, how does this work? And the current theories in science can't explain it, but the revised version of electrodynamics can, and it can also explain all the relativistic data that we have. So it, you don't need these other theories, and but we'll see how it works in the long term. We may have a war and everything is turned upside down. We'll see.
So maybe to sort of comment to Nick, I think one of the issues is at the beginning, you have to say, you may think that GPS uses relativity. Well, I'm here to tell you that it doesn't.
Right.
That might be the first thing that you need to say in your presentation.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah. And
They lie about it. They say, yes, it does.
Yeah, I have to also reference
he's there to say it doesn't. That's my point.
And furthermore, not only does it not use it, but it contradicts it. If you look at it properly.
That's Nick's first point that he tried to get at in this first presentation. The question is, how does a technological system, how does it violate everything Einstein says? Well, it has an absolute system of time. Whoops, that's not what Einstein says.
And a single preferred frame. And if you try to use any other inertial frame as the base frame, that's significantly different than the ECI frame, then you'd be sending people to their death everywhere.
And there's only one time differential between the ECI and all the other clocks up there. It's not between all the different clocks moving at all different velocities.
No.
Yeah, that's where it gets kind of flaky. And what Einstein said, Einstein's thing is just too metaphysical to really make any sense out of it. That's the problem. It's too metaphysical. His two postulates are just metaphysical ideas that you know, well, how do you actually make these metaphysical postulates into something that really works? Okay, it's you can't. You just can't do it. That's the whole point. GPS isn't anything that uses Einstein's metaphysical postulates because it just doesn't work. If you insist on his postulates, it won't work.
But that's so fundamental. And nevertheless, the received wisdom is that without relativity, we wouldn't have GPS, we wouldn't have mobile phones, we wouldn't have television, we wouldn't have everything that we use in the modern world. That's the received wisdom.
But those are the same people who say if you get vaccinated, you won't get COVID.
Correct. Yeah, that's great.
Harry, what was your background before you retired?
I'm an electrical engineer.
But what did you do?
I worked in the satellite communications business. I worked for ComSat and GTE, GTE SpaceNet, which was part of GTE Telephone before they got bought by Bell Atlantic. I also worked at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and we worked on this project called SatTrack, where they use the PRN technology. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the pseudo-random noise codes, and that's the same technology that's used in GPS. Actually, Ron Hatch worked on that. He worked on the transit system, as I recall, at one point, which was invented by Johns Hopkins. Does that answer your question, Dennis?
Yes, thank you.